Hello and thanks for visiting our website, rebuilderinAbox.com. Today we're going to learn how to rebuild the Denso gear reduction. Later years shortened to the word Denso gear reduction. Here we have two different styles with two different styles of hookup. The battery post and the variable parts that you'll see on these is where the ignition trigger wire comes in. Sometimes there'll be a weather tight pin connector. Sometimes there'll be a post with extensions going around the side or around the back. Sometimes it's a 1/4 inch spade connector. But they're basically function all the same, and the rebuild process is basically all the same. This is the motor here and here. This is where the armature and fields are. And on this side over here and here is where the solenoid assembly is. These are popular on Honda, Toyota, and Chrysler products. These two Chrysler products here, two of the most popular ones. This is the 8-cylinder Dodge Ram pickup, and this is the Chrysler minivan with the 3.3 or the 3.8, which is recognizable by the lineup pin. There are several places on the net that show you how to replace the contacts, which is the most common failure point in these. We don't necessarily frown upon that, but we're going to show you how to rebuild the whole thing. So the tools you're going to need either a 12 or 13 millimeter wrench to take that nut off. These three screws here are 7 millimeter. The two bolts holding the nose piece on are 9 millimeter. Probably have to get a deep well or an extension to go with that. And then these two bolts here will be 8 millimeter or 5/16. So you're going to need a 7, 8, and 9 millimeter, and then a wrench for this right here. Most of them are 12 or 13. Let's begin by taking the motor lead off. Just leave the boot on there. Then you'll see the two Phillips heads up in the top, here and here. Take those out. And then take these three solenoid cap bolts out. Those are 7 millimeter. Then we're going to take the cap off. And there's a gasket under there which is normally reusable. Pull the plunger assembly out, and with it comes the spring. And just lay those aside. Then we're going to take our 8 millimeter or 5/16 and take the two long through bolts out. Then we can just tap the back lid off. Now what we're going to do is hold on to the round part. Take that off as an assembly. The armature comes right out. Now looking down into the drive end housing, you'll see the two 9mm head bolts down in there. Take those out next. Now you might want to do this next step on a newspaper or on a clean tabletop, so that if parts tend to fall out, you don't lose anything. If you hold it like this and tap down, you're holding on the solenoid and tapping down on the nose cone, you can get it apart pretty easily. Now what this is, there's 5 rollers in here and then a ball down inside this hole. There you can see the ball, and there's an outer gear, and there's the 5 rollers, and the plastic cage that keeps them. Then the Bendix itself comes out, and we're finished tearing it apart. Okay, let's just do a quick parts inventory, and I'll explain to you what has to be done to each part so we can put it back together. The cap, wash everything all up, take a piece of sandpaper and sand these 2 contact areas here, then put a thin layer of white lithium grease on it. The solenoid cap, wash it up, put a thin layer of white lithium grease up inside the hole. The housing, brush holder assembly, the brushes, if they're look like that or close to that, they'll be fine. Wash everything up. You can spray the inside of the housing with a either a dielectric paint or some sort of flat paint. Make sure that the brushes have nice smooth travel on them. Take your finger and work them in and out. Make sure that everything is not getting jammed up, there's no rust or corrosion. You can spray a little bit of WD-40 on the back end of these. Solenoid housing, we have to put new contacts in it. We'll show you how to do that. The plunger assembly, you can usually buff these off. The nose cone, not really going to go too far into depth with doing anything with that. You could take a piece of sandpaper and clean up where the bolts go through so that you know you get a good ground. Wash everything off. The Bendix has a bearing here and under here. Put some oil in it and repack as much grease as you can down into the bearing. And then the rest of the parts, the gear and the rollers and the ball and the spring and the bolts, just clean those up. The armature, take some Scotch-Brite, clean up the copper commutator. There's a neoprene cover on the rear bearing. Pick it off, put a couple drops of oil in there, put a little bit of white lithium grease, and then put the neoprene cover back on. This bearing doesn't have a cover, put a couple drops of oil in it. The brush holder, right where the 2 screws go down in, take a piece of sandpaper, clean them up so you get fresh metal. Take and put a thin layer of either dielectric grease or white lithium grease over top of that. We've arrived at this point right here, and we're looking down into the solenoid, and this is what we call in the electrical diagnosis as the aha moment. If you've seen any of the other videos, a lot of them have that, and that means that we see what the problem is, we see why the starter is here, and this is very common for the Denso gear reduction starter. This battery side contact will be burned up, and it's hard to see from the top view, but you can see the carbon arc that was left behind where it was making bad contact. And when we take this out, I'll show you from the side view, you can see where the copper is actually gone. Doing this job, you have to replace the contacts, and we want it to look like that when we're done, so we're going to show you how to do that. So we got one contact over here, which is the motor terminal. This is the one that the field lead was on, going over to the run the housing. Also, there's a small part of the coil attached to the motor terminal. The battery side, the side where the battery cable bolts on, has nothing attached to it on the inside. So to change these contacts, we're going to take a 14mm deep well and take both of these nuts off. Taking the battery side off first, the insulator has a flat washer, metal flat washer, then the plastic insulator, then there's a rubber water seal, then the stud, and the contact comes out. Then there's an insulator. To get the contact off the stud, just set the stud down on the table or the bench or whatever you got and tap down on the stud gently. It comes right out. Put the new one on, just the opposite. You could set it down into a deep well socket and tap it down in, kind of like a press fit. Then we're going to put the internal insulator in. Then put the stud. Then the water seal. Then the plastic insulator. Flat washer. And the nut. Here's a close-up shot of the contact, the battery side stud contact that we're taking out. And you can see this step down right here where the copper has been worn away. It's supposed to look like that. So this is what causes the Denso starter to click but not crank. It's a very common symptom for the Denso. Okay, next we're going to change the contact on the other side, which is pretty much the same thing. You just have to deal with this lead going down into the solenoid, down into the solenoid coil. It stays there. It's soldered on to the wires that go down into the coil, and it just stays there. Work around it. Do pretty much the same thing as on the other side. Put the new contact in. The trick to these is, where everybody screws up is, when you're tightening this nut and when you're tightening the outside nut on both sides, especially on the battery side, be very careful that as you're tightening it, the contact stays perfectly flat on the mylar surface. You may even have to take a chunk of wood or the soft part of a screwdriver or the bottom of your handle and hold down on this as you're tightening this up. But this contact tends to roll when you finish final tightening that, and it has to be very tight. When you're done, make sure that that is perfectly flat in there on both sides. Okay, let's start putting this thing back together. Set the housing in the vise face up. This part of the Bendix, we want to put a layer of grease all the way around, a generous layer of grease, preferably white lithium grease. Then set it down in. And that has to go all the way to the bottom of the hole. Sometimes you get a little bit of resistance. Then we're going to do the same thing with this gear. Put some white lithium grease generously all the way around it. Set it right beside it, and they should be flush on top. Then the plastic cage, the keeper, put it down in. Put the 5 rollers in the 5 slots where they go around the circle. Put some oil on those. The metal ball goes down inside that hole. Okay, now looking at the underside of the solenoid housing, you can see this hole which lines up on the peg and this hole which goes on the bearing. Set that on there, and it has to be tapped down on. Then you're ready to turn it over and put the 2 through bolts that have the 9mm heads on them back in. And get those down in there and get those as tight as you can right now, because if there's any vibration from the motor and anything wants to shake apart, that's where it happens at. Now we're ready to put the spring back down inside this hole. The stem and the plunger. Goes down in there. Put the lid on. Then the 3 screws that hold that on. Now we're going to set the armature down in the hole. Set the housing around it. What we're going to do is just take 2 fingers and spread 2 brushes apart at the same time so that it sits down over the bearing. Then to get the brushes down over the commutator, we're going to take either a pocket screwdriver or something pointy and work on 1 brush at a time. And as you put that 1 brush in, tilt the brush holder back towards that brush. Then go around in a circle move to the next brush and tilt towards that one. Sometimes you have to start over again, but it's not really that difficult. You'll notice the O-rings on the bottom and on the top. It's a good idea to reuse those. If they break, or if they're stretched out, or if they're cracked and old, after you get everything together, you can put RTV or some sort of gasket sealing material on the outside. Now we're ready to put the lid back on. Don't forget to sand the two contact areas and sand the two contact areas on the brush holder. Then we're ready to put the through bolts in and finish up with the two Phillips head short screws that go in to contact the brush holder to the rear plate. One thing that we really need to do carefully is pull this boot back and clean up that lead before we put it back onto the stud. Take a piece of sandpaper and sand it up real efficiently on both sides of that lead before we put it back on. Then when you put it back on, put a little dielectric grease on it and put the nut up very snugly with your wrench. Okay, let's just take a minute here and double check these two Phillips head screws to make sure that those are as tight as possible. We definitely don't want those coming loose later. You can check the starter before you reinstall if you want to. Lay it on the ground in front of a car and run a set of jumper cables down to it. Positive, the red lead goes on that post, and negative goes anywhere on the frame. That nose cone makes a good ground. And what we're going to do is, because of this a pin type connector, we're going to take a just an alligator clip and stick it down in there and get it on the pin, because that's the trigger wire. Put your foot on it so it doesn't kick away, and keep hands and fingers and tools away from this area right here, because the Bendix is going to be kicking out. Start with a series of short, fast bursts. And what we're going to be testing for is we want to see that the Bendix snaps in and out very, very quickly. You want to see it snap out and snap back in. No hanging up, no sticking. Okay, now all we're basically going to do then is just touch this to the hot wire, and that makes it run. We're going to do a free run test. We want to run it about 10 seconds and then let off, wait about 30 seconds to a minute so it doesn't overheat. And what we're listening for is rebuilders. A lot of rebuilders, the seasoned ones, they mainly go by the sound. So we're going to try and hear a nice smooth run, and we want to hear it achieve a certain RPM like this. And if your starter sounds like that, you're ready to install.